Hello everyone, it's Scott, and welcome to Day 4 of Murders at Karlov Manor Spoilers. So we got a lot of interesting cards to talk about today, but before we do that, remember to like and subscribe to this video and to our channel to get more content like this throughout Murders at Karlov Manor Spoiler Season. So let's get started with previews from Murders at Karlov Manor. So first we got Fugitive Codebreaker for 1 and a red mana. You get a Goblin Rogue, that's a 2/1. It has Prowess and Haste. So right there, I don't even want to talk about anything else at this point because right there, that makes it a good magic card. This immediately, in my mind, fits into the mono red deck because we're playing enough instants and sorceries in that deck that you're going to get a lot of Prowess activations, and having another low-cost Prowess Haste creature, I think, is a great addition to the mono red deck. So I think this is going to see a lot of play within that deck in Standard. Now, it also has Disguise 6. This cost is reduced by 1 for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. When Fugitive Codebreaker is turned face up, discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. So I can see situations where in Standard you might be willing to do this, where you've got a lot of instants and sorceries already in your graveyard from throughout the course of the game, and you can reduce this cost, and by doing that, you get to put 3 cards in your hand. You're not losing anything because mono red, we know, runs out of cards very often by the mid game. So under those circumstances, I could see you casting it for its disguise cost. You disguise it and then almost immediately flip it. So that way you would get that 3 cards into your hand, and that may be the difference in winning and losing. So I think there's a little bit of playability there, but where I think this is going to shine is in a dedicated disguise deck, because that ability in the late game, mid game, to replenish your hand is going to be a great ability in one of those decks. So definitely Standard playable, and I look forward to playing it in Standard. Next, we've got Prophetic Memory for 1 and a blue mana, a legendary enchantment. When Prophetic Memory enters the battlefield, draw a card. You have no maximum hand size. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've drawn more than 1 card this turn, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn -1. So I think this is actually a good magic card. First of all, we know you're going to get at least 1 +1/+1 counter because you're going to play it before you begin combat. So that's going to mean that you draw a second card. So one of your creatures is going to get at least a +1/+1 counter. So you get a card, a +1 counter, +1/+1 counter. And I think that in and of itself is okay. But in a dedicated deck where you're going to be drawing additional cards every turn, I think this is going to shine, where every turn you're going to be able to put additional +1/+1 counters on creatures. And I think this would be perfect in an invasive deck where we've got a lot of creatures with flying. So they can grow just a little bit, just enough to be able to go over the top and defeat your opponent that way. So I'm excited for where this sits in Standard, and we'll have to see where the right deck for it is as we move forward. Next, we've got Doppelgang. It has a cost of XXX and green and blue mana, and you get a sorcery. For each of X target permanents, create X tokens that are copies of that permanent. So to get a copy of a permanent, you've got to spend 5 mana. To get 2 copies, you've got to spend 8 mana. To get 3 copies, you'd have to spend 11. But as you increase the number of mana you're putting into it, you're doubling and tripling the number of copies that you're going to make of each of those permanents. And I think if you had the ability to cast this for 11 mana, it's a very, very powerful spell. The problem for Standard is we're usually not getting anywhere near that amount of mana in our hand to be able to, in essence, ramp into something that would be allowing you to make those second and third copies of cards. So for Standard, I think this has some limited playability there in the right build. Definitely would need a ramp deck, but I think in other formats like Commander, this is going to be a card that can turn into an all-star, because already we have Simic ramp decks in Commander, and I think those decks are going to be excited to have this card in it because you're going to be able to create 2, 3, 4 copies of cards and permanents as you go throughout the course of your game. Next, we've got Blood Spatter Analysis for a black and a red mana. When you get an enchantment, and when Blood Spatter Analysis enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target creature on opponent control. So, nice enter the battlefield ability, dealing 3 damage. And then, whenever 1 or more creatures die, mill a card and put a Bloodstain counter on Blood Spatter Analysis. Then, sacrifice it if it has 5 or more Bloodstain counters on it. When you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. When we think about a card like Lightning Strike, it's 2 mana on its own to do 3 damage. And a lot of time we are pointing our Lightning Strike at a creature. So this does the same thing as an enchantment, but then we get the benefit as creatures die over the course of the game. You're going to add Bloodstain counters to this, and eventually you're going to be able to pull a creature back from your graveyard. So I think there's some playability for this in Standard. I think definitely in Limited this will be a good and playable card that you're going to want to have in your deck, because you're going to have things that you can use that 3 damage on, and then over the course of the game you're likely to get to that 5 Bloodstain counters, and then you'll be able to pull the best card in your graveyard back into your hand and then be able to recast it. Next, we've got Barb Servitor for 3 and a black mana. You get an artifact creature. That's a construct, and it is a 1/1. It has indestructible, and when Barb Servitor enters the battlefield, suspect it. It has menace and can't be blocked. Whenever Barb Servitor deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card and you lose a life. Whenever Barb Servitor is dealt damage, target opponent loses that much life. So the fact that this is indestructible, I think makes it an interesting card, not only in Standard, but in other formats as well. We've seen cards like Toski have this same ability, and they do very well in Standard. And the fact that this is only 4 mana, because typically we've seen those, it's been 5 or 6 mana for those kind of cards. So I think the fact that it's a little bit cheaper is nice in Standard. And unless you have the ability to, in essence, use a spell like Dead Weight on it, it's going to be really, really difficult to destroy this and take it out because of that indestructibility. And again, because of the ability that when Barb Servitor is dealt damage, target opponent loses that much life, it's going to be even hard to block it, because you're not going to want to block it and then lose life every time you're blocking either. So it's an interesting card. We'll have to see how much Standard playability it is. Toski had some, but certainly in Commander and other formats, this is going to have more playability. Commander, I think it potentially can be an all-star in Commander, because having that ability to have indestructible and then to push damage onto your opponent when it's dealt damage, I think is a powerful ability. It'll definitely see play in the Commander format. Next, we've got Case of the Locked Hothouse for 3 and a green mana. You get an enchantment that's a case, and you may play an additional land on each of your turns. To solve, you control 7 or more lands. If unsolved, solve at the beginning of your end step. So I think, on turn 4, you're playing this, you get that additional land drop. Hopefully you've drawn that land already, and then you can solve this by turn 7, because we do have a lot of different ways right now in Standard to get additional lands in green onto the battlefield. So I think reaching the 7 isn't going to be too much of a problem. And when you solve it, you may look at the top card of your library anytime, and you may play lands and cast creature and enchantment spells from the top of your library. And I think that flexibility there is really important, because you can pretty much play almost anything outside of an artifact or an instant or sorcery. And I think in a dedicated deck that's going to have enchantments primarily, and then lands and creatures, I think this is a card that could fit into that. Now, is it Standard playable? If this was 3 mana, I would be much more excited about it, but 4 makes it a little bit more dicey when it comes to Standard playability. I think there is that possibility of being able to get this into a Standard deck, but we're going to have to get the right dedicated kind of ramp deck, because we want to ramp into that solved ability as quickly as possible, so we can, in essence, every time we see a land, we can play it off the top of our deck. Right, next, we want to talk about the lower rarity cards from the day. So first, we've got Rakish Scoundrel for 2, a black and a green mana. You get an Elf Rogue. That's a 3/3 with Death Touch. And it also has the Disguise ability. So when Rakish Scoundrel enters the battlefield or is turned face up, target creature gains indestructible until end of turn. And you can disguise it for 6, so 4 and a green or a black mana twice. And when you do, then you're going to be able to activate that ability as well of giving a creature indestructible. So the fact that it's an enter the battlefield trigger or a turn face up trigger, I think it gives it a nice little bit of flexibility, and it'll be a good card to play in limited. I don't think it's going to see standard playability. Next, we've got Repulsive Mutation for X, a green and a blue mana. You get an instant where you put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, then counter up to 1 target spell unless the controller pays mana value equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So this is a nice, simple counter spell if you have a creature on the field that has greater power than your opponent has open mana. But I think in the mid to late game, it's a ramp spell for one of your creatures where you're going to be able to grow it, 2, 3, 4 counters on it, and hopefully give it that ability to go over the top of your opponent's creatures. And I can even see you playing this and just pumping mana into it and not worrying about even countering a spell, because at instant speed, putting counters on a creature is not something we see very often. And as a result of that, I think it's got some standard playability because of that. Next, we've got Due Diligence for 2 and a white mana. You get an enchantment that's an aura, and enchant it, and you're going to enchant creature. When Due Diligence enters the battlefield, target creature you control other than enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and gains vigilance until end of turn. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has vigilance. So for an extra mana, basically you're being able to give a creature vigilance and +2/+2, and another creature that +2 and vigilance for that turn. So in limited, very nice spell to be able to use, but in standard, I don't think we're going to want to spend 3 mana on a spell like this. Next, we've got Karlov Haunch for a white mana. You get a artifact, food, equipment. Equipped creature gets +2, and you can pay 2 and tap and sacrifice Karlov Haunch. You gain 3 life. And when Karlov Haunch is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 1 and a white mana. And if you do, you create 2 1/1 white dog creature tokens, and its equip cost is 2. So another, possibly definitely limited playable card, but I don't really see an application for it in standard, because we've got other things that we want to do with our mana in standard. So I think this doesn't really have enough to be standard playable. Next, we've got Seasoned Consultant for 1 and a white mana. You get a Human Detective. That's a 1/3. And whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, Seasoned Consultant gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Good limited card. Possibly has, because it's a human, has some standard playability because of that. Next, we've got Essence of Antiquity. For 3 and 2 white mana, you get an artifact creature. That's a golem. It's a 1/10. It has Disguise for 2 and a white mana. And when Essence of Antiquity is turned face up, creatures you control gain hexproof until end of turn. Untap them. So I think this is a very interesting ability on the card, because remember, we can do Disguise at instant speed. So I can see you for 3 mana early in the game playing this as a 2/2 with Ward 2, and then in the mid to late game when your opponent is attacking or doing something that's starting to target your creatures, then you can actually flip it for its Disguise cost. Everything gets hexproof, and then they also get to untap. And in a combat situation, that could be very powerful, because your opponent has miscalculated how many creatures are going to be there to block, and the result of that could be a blowout for your side of the battlefield rather than your opponent's. And it is a 1/10, so if we do have a Toughness Matters deck, I can see this going into that. But outside of that, it's going to have some limited standard playability. Next, we've got Mistway Spy for a blue mana. You get a Merfolk Detective. It's a 1/1 with flying. So right there, good card on its own. It also has Disguise 2 for 1 and a blue mana. And when Mistway Spy is turned face up, until end of turn, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you get to investigate. So I can see this in the later part of early in the game. You cast it for 1 mana, you get a 1/1 blue flyer. And late in the game, that's when you would go ahead and cast it for its disguise cost. And then as part of that, again, when it's turned face up until that end of turn, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you get to investigate. So maybe you've made a big swing with 3 or 4 flyers, and you're going to do damage to your opponent. And as a result of that, each creature is going to create for you an investigate token. So I think in the right kind of deck, possibly in the Merfolk decks, we're looking for some more low-cost things in that deck. I think this has got some standard playability there. Next, we've got Tunnel Tipster for 1 and a green mana. You get a Mole Scout. At the beginning of your end step, if a face-down creature entered the battlefield under your control this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Tunnel Tipster. And you can tap it for green mana, and it's a 1/1. It's a common, so definitely a limited playable card here. Any kind of mana creature in a limited format is always a good thing. And then if you are able to use that ability to flip some face down creatures and get the +1/+1 counters on it, then I think that's a really nice payoff. Now, is it standard playable? I don't think so, because I think we've got better things to do with standard. And again, I don't know how much we're going to see our cloaked and our disguised creatures truly being a part of standard yet. If there is a dedicated disguise or cloak deck, then this would be a really nice creature in it, because it's going to keep growing every single turn. Next, we've got Agency Corner for 4 and a black mana. You get an Org Cleric. It's a 3/6 with the ability 2 and a black mana, sacrifice another creature to draw a card. If the sacrificed creature was suspected, draw 2 cards instead. I think a very limited playable card, but I don't see any standard playability for it. We just have better things. Next, we've got Clandestine Meddler for 2 and a black mana. You get a creature that's a vampire rogue and is a 3/2. And whenever Clandestine Meddler enters the battlefield, suspect up to 1 other target creature you control. Whenever 1 or more suspected creatures you control attacks, surveil 1. So it's an interesting card here. Definitely a good card in limited. And we'll see if a vampire deck might want this in standard. But being only a 3/2 makes it susceptible to things like cut down. So while allowing you to suspect one of your own creatures to get the benefit of that, meaning it has menace, but again, the downside of that is it can't block, I don't think is enough to make this a solid card in standard. Limited, I think it's very playable. Next, we've got Polygraph Orb for 4 and a black mana. You get an artifact, and when Polygraph Orb enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. You lose 2 life. So 5 mana to dig 4, draw 2, and put 2 in the graveyard. That's a pretty high cost for this. So outside of limited, I don't see this as seeing really any standard playability at this point. It also has, you can pay 2 and collect evidence 3. Each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card or sacrifice a creature. So that ability on it, I think in limited, is a nice ability because you're likely going to be able to collect evidence of 3 a couple times, pay the couple mana cost for it, and either force your opponent to discard cards, sacrifice creatures, or take that life loss. And all 3 of those in limited are very nice things. Next, we've got Repeat Offender for 1 and a black mana. You get a Human Assassin. It's a 2/1. And you can pay 2 and a black mana. If Repeat Offender is suspected, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Otherwise, suspected. So I think this is a card that definitely is limited playable because of the ability to grow that creature over the course of the game. If you have a way to get suspect on it without actually having to activate the ability, I think that's a very good thing. But otherwise, I don't see any standard playability for it because it's just not powerful enough to make the cut in standard. Next, we've got Innocent Bystander for 1 and a red mana. You get a Goblin Citizen, that's a 2/1, and whenever Innocent Bystander is dealt 3 or more damage, you get to investigate. Limited playable at best, and I'm not even sure if I would play this in limited because it's a 2/1 and something has to do 3 damage to it to get the benefit of it. So I'm not even sure that this is limited playable. Next, we've got Aftermath Analysis for 1 and a green mana. You get an Elf Detective. That's a 1/3. And when Aftermath Analysis enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards. And then you can pay 3 and a green mana and sacrifice Aftermath Analyst and return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tap. So I think this fits nicely into a mill deck. And we definitely have that in standard, and the ability to just, take all of the lands that you've milled over the course of the game and put them on the battlefield will give you a significant mana advantage for the rest of the game. So I think there's a little bit of standard playability here. Certainly in limited, a card I would want to consider, because that 3 toughness, prevents it from dying in combat a lot of the time. And late in the game, when you want some additional resources, you can spend the mana, sacrifice Aftermath Analyst, and then get all the lands you've got in your graveyard back onto the battlefield. Next, we've got Get a Leg Up for a green mana. You get an instant until end of turn. Target creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control and gains reach. So I think a very nice spell in limited, where you're going to be able to use this as a combat trick where you can increase its power, and then with that added reach ability, potentially be able to block something that has flying that wouldn't have otherwise been able to be blocked. So I think in that situation it's a good spell. I don't think it's got enough to make it in standard though, because you could throw a 1/1 in front of this creature if it doesn't have trample, and you lose the advantage of all the +1/+1s that you got from creatures that you control. Next, we've got Pick Your Poison for a green mana. You get to choose one. Each opponent sacrifices an artifact, each opponent sacrifices an enchantment, or each opponent sacrifices a creature with flying. So this is actually, I think, a standard playable card as a sideboard option in decks, because a lot of times when we think about artifacts, we think about enchantments, we think about flying creatures. Typically, it's only 1 or 2 of those that are on the battlefield at any given point, unless it's a dedicated artifact deck, a dedicated enchantment deck, or dedicated flying deck. So the result of that is you're likely to be able to kill the thing that you want to. Now, the downside of it is that it is at sorcery speed, so you only are able to do it on your turn, which makes it a little bit more difficult to use the card effectively, because they may play an artifact that you really want to be able to force your opponent to sacrifice, or an enchantment that you really want them to sacrifice. But in that intervening turn, when they were able to make decisions, cast a few more spells, then they might get it to a situation where you're not able to force your opponent to sacrifice the thing you really want them to. So that's the downside of the card, but I think it is definitely something that is playable in standard and a very good card in limited. Next, we've got Slime Against Humanity for 2 and a green mana. You get a sorcery, and you get to create a 0/0 green ooze creature token with trample. Put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is 2 plus the total number of cards you own in exile and in your graveyard that are oozes and or named Slime Against Humanity. A deck may have any number of cards named Slime Against Humanity. So this is an interesting card. I think in limited, if you've got multiple copies of this or multiple oozes, I think it's a good card. But in standard, it's more of an against the odds card, because you would have to dedicate yourself to ooze to really ramp this and make it work very well. So I think for that reason, it's not going to see much, if any, standard play. Next, we've got They Went This Way for 2 and a green mana. You get a sorcery, and you get to search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle, and investigate. 3 mana for a land, and investigate's a little bit above cost for this, because a lot of times we see 1 mana, go search a basic land, put it in the battlefield, or put it in your hand. So I think that additional 2 costs of this, even though you get that investigate token, I think outside of limited is probably too much for standard. All right, that's day 4 of spoilers from Murders at Karlov Manor. I'll be back tomorrow with more spoilers from Murders at Karlov Manor. And you can take a look at the previews we've done from day 3 and day 2. If you haven't had a chance to look at those, you can click on the link provided to get access to those videos. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.